So we're kickstarting the conversation on governance of green transitions here at the Institute of Innovation Public Purpose at UCL. Let me briefly just say the overall idea was to convene a number of talks on different aspects of the green transition, because needless to explain, there are multiple crises and they amplify differences and inequalities that became even more visible. But it's also inspired a lot of hopes, big hopes, to initiate more progressive change, make our societies more green, inclusive, equal, just. And therefore, there emerged various narratives, also inspired by post-COVID recoveries, that have a global appeal, such as Building Back Better. And also, I felt that just transition also re-emerged, despite originating way earlier in the 70s, 80s. Re-emerged is another powerful narrative that has that global dimension. At the same time, it's also clear by now that just transition is not just one, or transition is not just one, and there are many, and they also mean different things to different groups and different regions. And in the grand scheme of things, just transition means no one is left behind, perhaps, we could put it that way, but also what does it mean exactly? So that was the inspiration that on which the idea to convene, to invite and discuss the just transition happened. So today we focus on one of the dimensions, on the question of justice in the discourse of just transition. And we will talk about various narratives of justice, of some contradictions, even perhaps tensions and challenges in these narratives, but also cooperation areas and spaces. Finally, I hope that we can also look a little bit into COP as a forum, because obviously this was not an intention to have a pre-COP conversation, but because it coincided with the timing, perhaps we can also look with some hopes for upcoming COP27 event. Before we go on, I should also say that part of the not part of the reasons, but this conversation is also related to the projects that Peter and Eva, myself and Frederick, who's not here, have been jointly working on the global narrative of just transitions. And this is a project that is funded by the British Academy on just transitions. Let me introduce our speakers briefly, and then I can give them the floor. Dunja Krause. Dunja is a research officer at the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, where she leads the Environmental and Climate Justice Program that focuses on just transitions and transformative adaptation. Dunja is also co-editor of the volume Just Transitions, that Social Justice in the Shift Towards Low Carbon World, published by Pluto Press 2019. Welcome, Dunja. Great to have you here with us.
Thank you very much.
Katie Galvey-Swan. Katie is an economic affairs officer at the United Nations Conference on Trade Development. She works in climate development, and prior to joining UNCTAD, Katie worked at Boston University Global Development Policy Center, looking at how trade, development finance, and climate policy can enable a global just transition. She's also currently commissioner on the Scottish Government's Just Transition Commission and is convener of the Scottish Women's Budget Group. Welcome, Katie. Great to have you with us tonight. There is also Eva. We are joined by Eva Pesha. Is an assistant professor in contemporary history at the University of Groningen. She leads a project funded by the European Research Council titled AfroExtract: Environmental Histories of Resource Extraction in Africa. Through this project, she works on case studies of oil drilling in Nigeria, copper mining in Zambia, and gold mining in South Africa. And this project seeks to understand people's lived experiences of environmental transformation. Welcome, Eva. It's great to have you here as well. And last, but certainly not the least, we also have Peter Newell, who is a professor of international relations at the University of Sussex, and also a co-founder of research director of the Rapid Transition Alliance. His research focuses on political economy of low carbon energy transitions, but he also undertaking research, advocacy, consultancy work on different aspects of climate change for 25 years. He also sits on the board of directors of Greenpeace UK and also undertook advisory work for the governments of the UK, Sweden, Finland, and for other international organizations. Welcome, Peter. Well, I am within this fabulous company that I have today. It's really my pleasure to perhaps kickstart the conversation by asking a general question. If each of you could reflect on how justice is defined in your work. We have academic work, we have policy work that you engage with. So how justice is defined in your work, or how do you define justice in the context of green transition in your academic or policy work? Maybe we can start with Dunya. Would you like to come in first?
Sure. Thank you very much again for the nice invitation and warm welcome. So not all of you may know UNRIST, I assume, because it's a fairly small institute that has been around for almost 60 years now, though. It's the UN Research Institute for Social Development, which undertakes interdisciplinary research and policy analysis on the social dimensions of contemporary development issues. So a fairly broad mandate. And I just wanted to read you the first sentence of our mission statement, which says, through our work, we aim to ensure that social equity, inclusion, and justice are central to development thinking, policy, and practice. You can see that it's really, justice is a very central topic in our institute's mission. It's kind of cross-cutting through all of our different program areas. And of course, therefore, also very important component in all the work that we do related to the environment and climate. And I have been involved in the last 4 years or so with a project that started this Just Transition Research Collaborative, where we really took a fairly broad and intersectional approach, I would say, to look at, on the one hand, distributional justice, but also procedural justice, and of course, questions of recognizing historic processes of discrimination and marginalization that we need to overcome in all areas of policy, but also in the green transition. And so we did actually start in our Just Transition work by just mapping out how different actors approach justice, how justice is negotiated between different groups, and then essentially for whom justice is being pursued and or achieved. I have to admit, I don't think we ever sat down and nailed down a very specific definition of justice, but I think that gives you a flavor of how we're approaching it and how central it is through all of the work that we do.
Great, thank you. Katie, would you like to come in as well?
Sure, thank you, Olga, and thank you for having me today to participate. I suppose I would preface my contribution by explaining that I wear numerous hats in approaching the just transition question, and I'd like to highlight these different scales. So first of all, of course, is my role at UNCTAD, where the team I sit in has been proposing a multilateral policy mission of delivering a global Green New Deal. And this is distinct from national Green New Deal sort of campaigns, in that it's focused on what's required of the multilateral system to be able to unlock just transitions in every region and nation. That's, simply to achieve full and decent employment in advanced economies, while at the same time enabling developing countries to get out of the vicious cycle of debt traps and extractive economic relationships and sustain their own green economic diversification and public investment strategies. And because of the mandate of UNCTAD, which focuses on how to integrate the Global South into the globalized economy in a sustainable and prosperous way, the departure point for this project is really the right to development, exploring how to tackle the development challenge while also securing climate goals. And I think that right to development angle is where justice comes into that within the sort of global international system. The second hat I wear is on the Scottish Government's Just Transition Commission, as you mentioned, and this is an independent commission that has been set up to scrutinise and advise the Scottish Government's Just Transition strategy. And of course, I bring my lens from my work of multilateral frameworks to this post, but the focus is really on the national level and the multitude of choices and trade-offs that have to be made by a country with limited resources, and in the Scotland case, limited legal manoeuvre, considering the constitutional settlement with the UK government, in being able to mount their own just transition. So the Commission takes as its starting point, that Scotland needs to be as ambitious as possible with its decarbonisation goals, but the costs and opportunities of transition need to be fairly distributed. But of course, how we interpret fairly distributed is the contested space. And in this way, I would like to see the Commission, and by extension the Scottish Government, moving beyond, how can we avoid transition impacts that are negative on people, which is of course really important, but I think it's meant a narrower focus on directly affected workers and a lot of just transition considerations, not just in Scotland, but to instead move towards seeing transition as a transformative opportunity to retrofit our economy to better deliver for people in Scotland. And that means integrating both mitigation and adaptation thinking into that just transition concept, and ultimately seeing just transition as a whole of government mission. The last hat I wear, as you also mentioned, is as convener of the Scottish Women's Budget Group, which, as explained by the title, is a national level members organisation of policy thinkers and economists looking to advance feminist economic approaches into Scottish policy making at all levels. So that's also the local level as well as the national. And our understanding of just transition is a lot more focused on intersectionality and what it means to have a feminist transition. It's not just about representation of women in the high value sectors which may emerge from transition, which I think has gotten probably more focused from the sort of gender lens of transition, but it's also about the kind of economic fundamentals that are necessary to avoid negative impacts on women and other marginalised groups, and indeed to improve their economic status. For me, that means bringing in the care economy. As much as achieving climate goals will require a retrofit of physical infrastructure, it also demands a rethink of social infrastructure, whether that's because of impacts from labour adjustment and the need to rethink social protection systems, or whether that's better valuing the low carbon jobs in the care economy that our whole economy depends on. So I'll wrap up there and leave more detailed comments to the conversation. But just to quickly summarise, I touched on those 3 different scales. At the top, the sort of multilateral system, then the national level, and then that intersectional level, which kind of intersects with the other 2. I'll stop there. Cheers.
Yes, thanks. Indeed, we hope to perhaps unpack or travel between those layers during the next hour and a half. Of course, it's obviously quite complex, but at least we can touch on some of them. Eva, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Olga. I think actually Katie's last point about the 3 levels, that's what I kind of try and do on a daily basis as an Africanist historian, is to try and give people stories and lived experiences of what a just transition might have meant to their lives, and to differentiate in that respect between global north and global south, rural and urban, to see how development schemes and industrialization are experienced and lived on different levels, to differentiate in terms of gender, class, and race, but also within those categories. A mine worker's wife might have very different experiences than a woman practicing urban agriculture in the vicinity of a mine. And I guess through my work, I also try to draw attention to the fact that justice for one can have unjust effects for other people. So I guess what I try to do is complicate this idea of justice. And as a historian, I might not have the most positive story of justice to tell, just because, yeah, injustice has prevailed more often, I guess, than justice throughout history. But I think by documenting these stories of injustice, we can reach a better and more precise definition, perhaps, of what justice would entail, by trying to see why previous attempts at achieving justice perhaps failed, we can try and devise better policies for the future. And I think the importance is being precise, so tailoring our policies for specific local contexts, but also being attentive to the fact that what works for one person might not work for another person. Thanks.
Peter, would you like to come in as well?
Sure, yeah, and just like others, thank you for convening this and putting it together. It's great to be here. So yeah, I guess like others really, I think about justice in very different ways. Obviously on one level, you can think about the typologies, the procedural, the distributional, the recognition justice, like who even gets to be seen as a valid stakeholder with a place at the table, and that has lots of implications when you're talking about formal economies, informal economies, actors that are often excluded deliberately from processes like Indigenous people's organisations, etc. We can think about the intergenerational elements, those often drop out of some of these conversations, or also restorative justice. And this sort of makes me think of another project I was involved, also supported by the British Academy, looking at the question of civic space and just transitions in fossil fuel dependent economies in Africa. So to link back a little bit to some of the things that Eve was just saying. And there, you know, particularly colleagues in Nigeria were talking about the need for restorative justice, because their concern coming from groups they were working with is that justice is always about something that gets delivered tomorrow or in the future. It's less so often about, well, is there some compensation, some recognition of where things have gone wrong in the past? Again, picking up on what Eva was just saying. And so for them, they want discussions around compensation for oil spills on land, for promises unfulfilled in the past, before there's any credibility about claims going forward about just jobs or decent jobs, etc. When we talk about the new oil boom in Nigeria or a gas boom in Mozambique, etc. So I think we need to sort of keep that element as part of the picture. And so I think, yeah, also picking up on what Eva was saying, really, I sort of see this disconnect somehow between academic conceptualizations and distinctions about these different categories of justice and more vernacular understandings and practices of justice, where things like climate justice or energy justice, which is, I guess, where I come into it a bit more, inevitably intersect with questions of land and food and agrarian justice. So it's always about questions of livelihood and work and who gets to own and make money from key assets. Like, you really can't avoid some of those deeper political economy questions, I think, when we're thinking about these issues. And really, although you asked us to think about our definitions of justice, it's sometimes easier to say what injustice looks like than it is to clearly pinpoint and define one notion of justice that will travel across all of these different levels that we've already been talking about. So for me, like bringing in the sort of politics and the governance, given that I'm an international relations person, it's always about how do you recognize, but then mediate and try to resolve or at least bridge competing claims in fair and transparent ways. It's really about the inevitability of conflict over different ideas of justice, the inevitability of trade-offs between these different notions, but then what do you do about that? What's the policy process across these scales that allows you to recognize those differences and move beyond them and continuing to try and accelerate the transition? Because clearly we can't resolve all of these aspects. And that's one thing that concerns me slightly in the just transition debate, particularly when I see it being invoked by incumbent actors and quite powerful oil and gas companies sometimes, that somehow we need to address all of the historic social and economic inequalities before we can advance more ambitious action, or before we can accelerate the transition. And it's interesting to me that they never normally evoke those sorts of issues as things that need to be resolved as they enter and exit economies on a routine basis. But somehow when it comes to climate action, suddenly we have this very long list of justice criteria that have to be met before further action can be undertaken. So I think we need to be quite careful about justice claims and claims about justice transitions. Some of them are very, very genuine and absolutely to do with jobs and livelihoods and protecting the poor and some of the things that Katie was talking about in terms of social protection. But we also need to be alert to the ways in which I think it can also be used as a delaying tactic. So justice, yes, delay, no. Because if we don't act quickly and effectively and go for the more sort of transformative outcomes that Katie was talking about, then we'll end up compounding injustices, particularly for some of the poorest groups, within and between societies that, of course, are least responsible for climate change in the first place. And I'll stop there.
And thanks a lot. Let me go with the notion of narrative. And what to me is, I don't work specifically on just transitions, but I see some similarities with the narrative of net zero, climate, finance in general, that it's very neat and it's very coherent in a way. And there are so many positive things that the policies, just transition policies, should solve. Inequalities, to make it, to basically to bring good future, to be climate friendly, to bring more equality, eliminate injustice to some extent. And I wonder whether we need, or whether there is a possibility for a global narrative of just transition, or is it all super local, or what is that intricate interplay between global and narrative that multilateral institutions are disseminating and creating? And what are the interactions? How do you see it from where you are, from your work? Dunya, maybe you would like to come in?
Sure. I think that's a really interesting and crucial question that goes back to a lot what the others have just pointed out, no? Because I think on the one hand, yes, absolutely, we need a global narrative in order to be able to come up with an approach that is built on international solidarity and that takes into account these differences between countries, especially kind of global north, global south, these inequalities, because we otherwise just kind of exclude a large portion of people who are directly affected by the consequences of our failure from the discussion. If we just take the example of a lot of kind of just transition policies and actions that are taken maybe in the global north to protect workers there, to try and come up with an approach, which I'm absolutely for, and we do need those, of course. But if we miss the link to what is happening, if we don't really achieve the transition fast enough, I think for this kind of, for this complexity, we absolutely need a global narrative. I think at the same time, we shouldn't try and kind of push through like a single definition or narrative of how the just transition should look like. I think that does also need to be pluralism, because a lot of the effects are very context specific and they are localized. Also, the solutions I think need to be localized, but maybe we need something like a multi-level approach that is based on certain kind of broad criteria, which I think we do have in the multilateral system. No, I mean, all countries have signed on to the Paris Agreement and are still not really doing what it takes in order to meet the targets that are set out in it. But so I think one of the ways that we could try and tackle that in the just transition discourse is really to try and come up with something like a global narrative that leaves room for localization in each context. And I think that's one of the things that in the climate discourse, maybe we can speak about that later a little bit, but that gets sidelined a lot, in my opinion, or in my perception, because the whole idea of just transition that's under the COP complicated work streams and so on sits in the response measures debate. And the idea of looking at the impacts of response measures originally was one that exactly tried to tackle this, that recognized, okay, if we take climate action in one place, it might have consequences in another, or if we don't, if we do something that doesn't work, then it also has impacts on other countries. And so there was this international dimension, and also this idea that we need to help especially poorer countries achieving their own goals and not leaving them behind. That was very clearly there from the start. And I think that often gets sidelined in the current debates that focus very strongly on workers, but kind of miss out the international debate quite often, I think.
Yes, indeed. And Eva, may I invite you in, because you work, in that sense, you work on a super localized, super personal lived experiences, right? How would you, from your work, from your own experience as a researcher, as a historian, how do you see it? Is there a need? What is that? Do we need a global discourse? I mean, besides agreeing that this is important and we need to do it fast, right?
I guess that's a really good question, but I would like to start by pointing out that you can't really separate the global and the local anymore. They're not like neatly distinct fields. And in this respect, I'm, for example, referring to European and North American transition narratives around a green and just transition, which still rely heavily on the extraction of metals. Copper is, I guess, a bit more spread out over the world, but cobalt and lithium are very heavily concentrated in, just one country, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in order to realize, I don't know, electric cars, solar panels, windmills in Western Europe and North America, we need cobalt. And I'm not saying that because cobalt extraction is causing all kinds of negative environmental effects around mines that we shouldn't be using solar panels. It's not as easy as that. And also closing these mines would have very negative effects on people's livelihoods who are already invested in mining. But this is just to suggest that the narratives, I guess, are a bit more complicated. But I think we can move forward just by generating knowledge among consumers of solar panels, that these things are also produced in specific places, that they are not just bought in a shop, and that people are set to work to realize this green solution. But also drawing attention to the fact that different people have different responses to resource extraction. Some might be in favor of it, others might be much more critical. And drawing attention to these stories, I think, is already a very important first step towards realizing that justice might be a bit more complicated than it appears at first sight, I guess.
Katie, would you like to come in? I see you're nodding.
Yeah, well, I mean, I obviously work in quite a different realm from Eva, but what I agree strongly with that sort of the complexity of what justice might look like. I suppose I've put some documents in the chat, which I am kind of referring to, if they can be shared with the audience. But I suppose, I work in the policy world, so thinking at this question on a global narrative from like a policy perspective, I think it's clear from our work that the smoothest, most peaceful and most prosperous route to achieving decarbonisation alongside social and economic goals is through a stronger multilateralism. That's not to say that other pathways don't exist, but that I think the optimum route has to be through a stronger multilateralism. And this is, again, just to take the sort of UNCTAD lens of the position of the Global South and their integration at the global economy. There's significant barriers to be able to meet climate targets for a lot of countries. Across the Paris Agreement means of implementation, the finance, technology and capacity pillars. So just to quickly tackle those, in finance, the 100 billion goal of climate finance has not been met by advanced economies, a promise that was made over a decade ago. Currently, 60% of low-income countries are in or on the edge of debt distress. They are extremely exposed to global financial instability, and external financing is very expensive, trapping them in the vicious cycle of debt distress and underinvestment, which puts a just transition nigh on impossible. In technology, there's also a severe disadvantage. The majority of intellectual property rights are owned in advanced economies, which means there's a net transfer of wealth from south to north, for all technologies, but it means the transfer of green technologies is so far elusive. And if we've seen during the pandemic, which is of course ongoing, you know, the challenge of being able to open source or share the COVID vaccine technology was so difficult, and it actually still hasn't really happened. We've got a hill to climb if we're going to ensure that life-saving technologies that are less immediate as vaccinations, but ultimately fundamental to achieving our climate goals, if they're going to be shared in the interests of those goals. And then in capacity, developing countries face a very different challenge of green adjustment, very high informality in their labour population, and an imperative to expand energy access to the 940 million people who currently don't have any access to electricity. So on top of those structural challenges, developing countries are also generally more exposed to climate impacts. They're experiencing relatively higher costs to their GDP and to lives, and they're also facing spillover impacts now from policy action on climate and advanced economies like the proposed carbon border adjustment mechanism. So overcoming any of those sorts of challenges will be next to impossible without cooperation. And there's sort of three basic conditions that we highlight. Number one is accelerated mitigation in advanced economies to be able to sort of create some developmental room. Number two is being able to fill the finance gap, primarily through public finance, to be able to crowd in finance, and then achieving green technology transfers to fill that technology gap. And all of those together, you know, Peter's highlighted some of the political economy challenges at that national level when it comes to land use and other just transition strategies for mitigation adaptation. But these conditions also require, you know, a renewal of our multilateral system that are, from a political economy perspective, really, really difficult. And from that perspective, you know, while just transition will always be primarily a local and national question of delivery and success, many of those local successes will forever be stalled if there isn't the sort of alignment at the multilateral level to enable them.
Yes, I understand that also, that refers, for example, that background paper, I think it was published just 2 or 3 days ago for COP27, there is a notion of enabling multilateral system. And I want to be a devil advocate in a way as a social scientist. I am, well, but that system, that very same system created those inequalities at first place, right? I mean, we don't need even to perhaps that we agree on that to some extent. So Peter, I would like to give floor to you. You have been working also extensively with looking at the actions of multilateral international organizations, global governance perspective. How do you see it? What are those levers for creating that enabling multilateral system, if at all?
Okay, well, I'm not sure I have all the answers, but I certainly share the critique that Katie and many others have spelled out. I mean, I think when I think about that concretely, I start thinking, how do you try and anticipate negative development outcomes, particularly when you're designing climate policy at national or international level? Because I sort of, you think about procedure in terms of getting all the key actors on board at a national level when you're designing a transition plan, but to try and anticipate what the knock-on effects will be in terms of the drive for critical minerals that Eva was talking about, or some of the things that Katie's just talked about in terms of IPR or trade rules. So I guess you start to think about, come back to your question, Olga, like there's intervention points in different spaces. So if I'm sat in here in the UK, there's lots of things the UK government can and should be doing. And of course, its messaging is appalling in the run-up to COP, considering new oil and gas licenses. But the UK is also, it was an actor in Europe, no longer, unfortunately, but it does have a voice with the World Bank. It does have a voice in the WTO. It can use its power, because it has more power than many other countries still, to try and shape those rules in a more enabling way. So I think that's how I start to think about it. But to come back to the prior point about a narrative, I mean, I guess what I was saying before, how difficult it is to build a consensus around one particular vision of a just transition. But of course, many MDBs and other institutions are trying to do precisely that, right? They've got these high-level principles to guide multilateral development bank support to just transition. There's move towards toolkits and so on. And of course, they're operating in quite a general level, politically probably necessarily so that they can all buy into some very general principles. But what it does is obscure and disguise some of the conflicts. So you have ILO and other actors talking about social protection. You have UNCTAD, as we've just been hearing from Katie, talking about the need to address trade and debt, which is obviously a key driver of countries wanting to tap new fossil fuel resources, which would be disastrous from a climate point of view. But then you have the IMF talking about mobilizing private finance as the main solution, not really necessarily talking about that broader development picture, let alone thinking about all the different climate dimensions. And so you have very different actors with a very different vision and frankly, a different ideology about how to achieve more beneficial outcomes. I guess where I end up with this, a bit like Katie perhaps, is how do you preserve the policy space for countries to meet or address some of these injustices and try and create a more just economy using a whole range of different levers, and that will be things which are increasingly constrained by trade policy. So it is infant industry protection or procurement or tax incentives or looser forms of intellectual property rights. It's all of those sorts of things which, as we know, richer countries have used all the way throughout their history to build up their industries. We now need to allow developing countries, I think, some leeway to use exactly the same tools and others to try and support a just transition.
Yes, couldn't agree more. I wonder, just following up on this, Peter, what are the incentives for, again, provocative question, I mean, what are the incentives for the countries who are more experienced in doing this to extend help beyond philanthropies, to extend it on a more systematic level, right? Transformative.
I mean, I think that there has been some elements of progress and some reasons to be hopeful. You know, there are countries who are willing to break from the traditional sort of like distinction of North and South to call for more transformative approaches. I know that the Scottish Government, of course, mentioned about the loss and damage financing at last year's COP. Although that doesn't necessarily cohere with their own approach to decommissioning or not supporting further expansion of fossil fuel assets in the North Sea. So again, contradictions there. And I think also Denmark recently at the UN General Assembly also supported that initiative. And I think, you know, there's obviously a variety of perspectives on loss and damage, being the sort of overwhelming financial impacts and loss of livelihoods and impact on lives that those countries that are most vulnerable to climate disasters face. There's a variety of perspectives about whether that's a good or bad not thing, but it is something that all global South countries have solidarity on, and I think that also is a reason for to build on. It's a foundation to build on, because I think that is one of the fundamental ways to have any sort of counterbalance to the overwhelming financial and otherwise power in advanced economies. But I think when, you know, that more philosophical question of points of leverage that you said there, you know, working on the Just Transition Commission in Scotland is very useful for me to see it from the other end. Obviously, I am Scottish, and my family are here, and I want this to be a prosperous and safe and healthy place for people to live in the future. And I think, you know, we know that the disproportionate responsibility for historic and current emissions lies with the advanced economies, but there exists also sustained underinvestment and extreme inequality in advanced economies too. And, you know, our analysis at UNCTAD would point to similar root causes to these challenges, and where workers everywhere have experienced downward pressure on wages and rights for a prolonged period, while global finance has reaped huge profits. That's not to say that there aren't local and national manifestations of that, but that trend of the a shrinking labour share of income and a astronomically increasing profit share of income, I think, is the leverage point. It's to say, that advanced economies will also benefit from having a more robust and supportive and enabling multilateralism. And so I sometimes find that we need to hold the advanced economies to account who can afford to spend trillions of dollars in pandemic stimulus response, but then have nothing to show for their climate finance commitments that nowhere near meets the actual demonstrated needs. Yes, we need to hold that to account, but I sometimes think that distinction can be misguided, as much as we should be perhaps thinking about the other dimension of people who need a just transition, and global finance, who has so far who are hoping for their own just transition and their own sort of subsidies to be able to write off their stranded assets or whatever. And I think that kind of, to go back to what Peter was saying about this the billions to trillions rhetoric of how private finance is going to come and save the day. Like, ultimately there has to be a role for private finance in being able to achieve a just transition, but it's whether or not they're in the driver's seat, or whether they are achieving they're receiving on the receiving end of the just transition that's financed by further public debt. So I suppose, just to point to that entry point for being able to better connect the challenges facing people in advanced economies and the majority of the world, which has been in a prolonged stasis of economic precarity and growing economic distress.
Dunia, would you like to come in and?
Sure. I have to say, if I'm honest, I have to admit that my answer really depends on whether I'm having a good day or a bad day, because I have bad days where I'm very cynical about this and don't have a whole lot of hope, because I feel like, okay, the main incentive for the richer countries is to either like export their own technology or actually make a profit through investments in transitions in other countries, or the use of also narratives that we've increasingly seen, I think, in Europe, to basically do development and invest in development and transitions elsewhere in order to stop migration. But I mean, I'm luckily not cynical, and I don't have bad days all the time. So I do also see a lot of the positive elements and the positive reasoning behind countries. So I do also feel that there are countries that are really genuinely trying to take on their responsibility and trying to become better at transitioning themselves and also supporting transitions elsewhere. That could be through like supporting different alliances, like something like the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance that was launched last year at COP as well. But I think also the increasing like voice that we see in many parts of the world that social movements have, climate activists have, that they also see they need to be responsible and accountable to their own citizens who are demanding the governments to do better. So I think there's a whole range of incentives there that go beyond kind of the moral, ethical obligations that countries also have when they sign on to the multilateral system and all the values that stands for.
Just to follow up, do you see these initiatives from the global north? Let's use this category. I really hate it, but let's use it for the sake of simplicity. Global north, global south. Do you see it happening multilaterally? So it's individual countries' initiatives, or is it the way that you see, producing some long-term results, or shall we still, is there still should be some sort of agreement within the group of high-income countries at the
ideally, I would like to see that for sure. Ideally, I think it has to happen in the multilateral system, as others have said before. No, we do need cooperation. We can't tackle this alone. But I think the reality in how climate negotiations are being held at the moment, and the different, there's so many contradictions and contestations within countries and between countries. And I think so far, like I'm really relatively pessimistic to see that kind of a really cross-cutting advance, because a lot of countries are still pushing their own ideologies and ideas. They're very much, the global north has really disappointed the rest of the world with their actions in the past, 20 or so years, and continues to do so by kind of pushing for we're all in the same boat narrative, just kind of trying to shift away responsibility. So I do think we have, for now, we have to kind of grasp these more on the side alliances and approaches of certain countries that are maybe more willing, and then hope that that will catch on and spread through the system as a whole. But I don't know. I'm not super optimistic on that front, to be honest.
Because I mean, also somehow that I maybe assume also that there is a unified voice of high-income countries, but it's not. Also, even going back to the bad days you sometimes have and thoughts you have, and you refer to, okay, at least the rich club, the club of rich countries, well, they will be better off themselves. So let's help developing world so we stop migration, for example. Very right-wing, popular nowadays, goal. But at the same time, even to the problems of excessive migration, not all countries are exposed evenly, right? So I also feel that, well, my bad perhaps as well of introducing this category of the global north, but it's also not a unified camp.
I think there are some, on the broader issues, I think there are definitely very clear multilateral negotiations where all the countries are kind of on the same page on trying to find certain solutions. I don't think that has happened for just transition yet, in my perception at least. I think there's a really interesting graph. I don't remember where it came from. It might be by the UNFCCC itself, that shows the negotiating blocks of different countries. And it's this very intricate graphic of all the different countries and like what kind of negotiating blocks they're in, which I think shows that just depending on topic, countries group together and they push for a certain agenda, right? Because we're dealing with such a complex situation that I think not any one country will be on the same page for all of the different aspects of climate action. No? So I think even within countries, there's quite a bit of contestation and difference in approaches depending on what we're looking at. So yeah, I don't think it's realistic to expect like a really unified approach that goes beyond what we have in place right now.
And just to quickly come in on that, I think we've mentioned a little bit about IPRs, intellectual property rights, and maybe restrictive trade and investment rules which hold back certain developmental strategies for developing countries, but also for advanced economies. And I think it's interesting to observe the World Trade Organization sort of dispute mechanism right now, and obviously that's been hampered, but there are only a few months ago, Europe initiated not a full-on dispute, but basically went into consultation with the UK over one of their subsidies for a renewables program and a local content requirement. And I think there's going to be similar consultations that countries bring for the US. And so there is, a potential for, advanced economies to be they are competitive with one another. They want to be able to secure their supremacy within these supply chains, which leaves very little space for cooperation and very little space for solidarity. But while they might be fighting it out, they might still be able to economically survive. The majority of the world will not. That won't change the status. So I think you're right that that they're not necessarily always on the same page. In fact, they can be in conflict with one another. But I think that isn't necessarily a good thing for developing countries either. And then furthermore, I would say that they can be on the same page when it matters for them. Like, for example, with blocking of the waiver for COVID vaccines at the WTO, when, you know, countries that might otherwise not have been, you know, great friends with one another, but they had a common interest, which was to prevent the IP that was owned by companies in their jurisdictions from being shared with developing countries. And, you know, that common interest is the same. So I suppose I would love to see, and you know, again, coming from Scotland, where we have this Just Transition Commission, and there's been some positive rhetoric, which has not necessarily proved the test of, you know, having the same legal powers as the UK government. I would love to see a group of countries that is North and South coming together that can sort of move beyond this dichotomy on issues like loss and damage, just transition, and be able to actually carve out what does it look like to not be in this race to the bottom or to the top of the green supply chain future, but actually to do that cooperatively, to do that through some sort of, you know, internationalism. And I don't know if beyond you know, the JET-P model, which maybe someone else wants to talk about, the Just Transition partnership with South Africa, I don't think we've seen that in a positive way yet. But I'll stop there.
Yes, Eva, I would like to bring you in. Would you like to comment on that? I noticed your hand at some point, some time ago.
Yeah. No, very important things are being said, but I think, and maybe I'm too idealist in this respect, but I do think that by sharing policy-making responsibilities and sharing this agenda-setting power more broadly, I kind of feel that maybe implementation would also become a bit easier. Because now what oftentimes happens is that global financial institutions make the policies and then rely on some kind of participatory decision-making to get the implementation right. But I feel that if the participatory decision-making happened at an earlier stage and kind of played a role in the policy that was trying to be implemented in the first place, I would like to believe that somehow the implementation would become more effective as well, although you would get more disagreements at the policymaking stage already. But yeah, I see this kind of tension being quite problematic as well, that the policy is made by one set of actors who rely on, for the implementation, on another set of actors. But yeah, if we could somehow address that more effectively.
And that's, of course, the issue of representation, right? So when we talk about the first group of actors that make policies. Peter, would you like to come in here again on?
Yeah, I can just riff off that, I guess. I mean, it's the point he was just making really hit home to me, actually, at the Paris Climate Summit, where there was a lot of talk about a clean energy revolution. It was going to be this massive mobilization of private finance to meet the energy needs of the poor. But there was zero discussion about whose energy needs we were actually talking about, or what the theory of change was about how those energy needs would be met. You know, going back to what Katie was saying before, if you think about the number of people that are still without access to electricity in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, or that can't afford the connection charges and so on. It was like, well, what's actually the model? You know, you're de-risking and mobilizing large amounts of private finance almost as an end in itself, rather than with a clear sense of like exactly how that finance will be deployed to get to the right people. And this is one of my concerns. There's a sort of the finance that does get mobilized gets captured by certain actors. It often isn't really being used to sort of tackle energy poverty. So I think there is a big issue there. And it raises all these fundamental questions about who benefits. I mean, years ago, we were doing some work in Kenya, for example, and again, a lot of talk about let's mobilize the private finance for geothermal, which was being touted as a sort of, you know, a viable low carbon energy pathway for the country. But in the end, it was the state really that set up this geothermal development corporation to try and scope out the possibility of this, you know, set up all the legal and policy frameworks for it. And then private financiers came in later on when it looked like it was going to be viable and profitable. And so I think with this energy transition, I guess I'm focusing particularly on energy, we do need to think about, are we going to avoid the mistakes of the past where it's the public sector really that's upfront taking the risks, incurring the debts when things go wrong, but private actors that are just there to sort of, you know, hover around the profits as and when they emerge. So I think we need to think about those issues, and that is partly obviously about the distribution of that money, but it is also procedurally, to come back to what Eve was saying about, you know, who participates in these spaces. And the broader point, I guess, for me, coming out of that project we had, was we have certain notions about what a just transition should look like, and we make assumptions about a strong state, mobilized trade unions, active civil society, democratic space in order to think about different pathways. And that really poorly describes, frankly, most countries around the world, but perhaps particularly resource poor countries or many states where those things just really don't apply. And that was certainly the case, you know, what we were doing in Kenya, Mozambique, Nigeria. It's really hard for people to sort of openly contest energy pathways. They're very far removed from the key policy decisions around investment pathways or choices about different energy infrastructures. So there's that bigger question of sort of democratizing it and opening it up. And there was a seminar earlier today, actually, it's by IASD on energy pathways and 1.5 compatibility in terms of the Paris Agreement. And they were talking about exactly these sorts of things. You know, how do you bring in the key actors? Because if you're just talking about gas as a transition fuel, this is one of the dominant discourses at the moment. That's just about plugging in another fuel, but the infrastructures and the power relations stay the same. Whereas potentially, at least with renewables, you're talking about mini grids, people being able to produce their own energy, having much more control. And so it is potentially more transformative, and we need to have that conversation as well, I think.
Yes, Peter, thanks a lot for bringing this notion, indeed, that we associate issues of political institutions or forums that are there, for example, Scottish Commission, right? I mean, to what extent voices can be brought together in, you know, it's very limited capacities that are there in the countries that need it most. And I feel also, in the grand scheme of things, our public politics space looks very different from where transformative negotiations took place 50, 60, 70, that I feel a little bit that we look at we put the hopes for transformative just transition while a bit nostalgic of those institutions where trade unions could do stuff. You know, and I'm just Katie, you're nodding. So I'm a little bit also, maybe it's just me having a bad day, like Dunya mentioned. I don't know. It's and it's beautiful, and this is what I would like to also maybe participate in. But sometimes I feel, where is the entry point? Where is the entry point for those communities and regions that they do not have access normally? Is it multilateral institutions that should walk a step forward? At which level? Is it regional level? Is it, shall we start with community, with local government? How to initiate that? What do you think?
I mean, I think all of the above, but that's obviously a difficult thing to deliver. I mean, like, ultimately, as has been discussed, you know, these transitions will be made or broken at the local level and how they deliver for people. And I think that even the challenge of resourcing that kind of engagement is not something that, like, every country is going to make capacity for. So I think that there are a lot of trade-offs. I mean, even in the Scottish example, where our most recent focus was looking at the Western Isles, which is the sort of incidentally the most westerly isles in Scotland, the Outer Hebrides, and looking specifically at how, you know, policies made in Edinburgh did not suit the needs of the people who were living on these islands, who had faced hundreds of years of oppression from people in the central Scotland, whether that's through linguistic oppression, religious oppression. And this is played out in the underinvestment historically in the islands and in their housing stock, in their energy system. And this is in an ostensibly very wealthy economy that should have all the levers to engage people, should have all the levers to stress test its policies and make sure it's not going to further marginalize the very marginalized within the country. So I think that there's, you know, a massive hill to climb at the local, national, regional, multilateral level. And I think it would be, yeah, I don't know if I have the quick fix for how you do that, but the resourcing of it is one of the major challenges, one of the major barriers. I think there's also, you know, to maybe touch on the, you know, there's the developmentalism that UNCTAD kind of takes as its MO, I think is also in need of a bit of a retrofit, because I think that maybe the traditional understandings of what that looks like, or where there has been success, has not necessarily been a just transition procedural process in being able to deliver developmental gains. It's also not being kind to the environment. So this question of what does a new development paradigm look for in a time of just transitions, I don't think that there has been I think that lots of different projects, you know, in the work that Dunya has done in particular, has approached this question of how you are able to deliver that amidst a sort of traditionalist developmentalism, which looks more authoritarian, which looks more extractive and exploitative. You know, what is the new model? And even talking about the model, there's no cookie cutter. So our whole language is not really suited to this task. So I wanted to also mention that. And then on that, what Peter was saying too about, you know, energy, just to go back to Stornoway very briefly, Stornoway, the biggest city on Lewis in the Western Isles. I was really inspired when I was there recently to look at the way that communities have just begun to achieve a just transition on their own, because no one was there to do it for them. And this isn't me advocating for just let communities do it as they will, because I think that that's a cop-out for the responsibility of elected governments and officials. But these communities bought out landowners and begun to set up their own renewable energy systems that had 20 times the local investment potential as the privatized energy system. So just as an example, the wind farm at Point has 3 wind turbines, and that's putting £900,000 back into the local economy for this one village every year, whereas the 6 turbines from the private company is £9,000 a year. So I think that the scale of that, you know, of community capacity that's often pretended to be not there, or pretended to be not good enough for being able to achieve incredibly ambitious projects, I think is another one of those myths that needs to be busted in this sort of just transition developmentalism.
Yes, I wonder, since we touched on energy already a couple of times, maybe we can take questions, because we have 4 questions there in the Q&A. And let's start with the first one. And then I will put it on the table, and then feel free to come in, whoever feels you would like to comment or respond. So unfortunately, I can't know the name. It's anonymous attendee. Hi everyone, I would like to know if the convergence strategy, quotation marks, is considered as crucial when talking about justice and transition, particularly in the context of an energy crisis and the fact that global north overuses energy. It is leading the development of green hydrogen industries in the global south. Who would like to comment on that?
I can start if you want. I assume it's referring to the contraction and convergence model. I'm guessing that's what the question's getting at. Because this is something that was started by the Global Commons Institute many, many years ago, and it's talking about per capita entitlement to use carbon. And the notion was the global north should dramatically contract its emissions to allow convergence up to this agreed per capita level of emissions. And it did get quite a lot of support at one point. I don't know currently who's sort of advocating for this at the level of countries, but I know like Cuba, India, other countries spoke out in favour of this. And in a way, it's quite hard to argue against it, right? Like do some people have more of an entitlement to carbon than others globally? It's quite hard to make that argument, I think, philosophically and morally and ethically. So it gets to the heart of the problem, and there are all these impressive graphics with a contraction and convergence approach about which countries would have to start declining and when. And it was precisely about allowing the expansion of the carbon budgets of poorer countries to meet this agreed per capita. So I think it makes huge amounts of sense politically. Of course, it's very, very difficult. And there were lots of discussions, like the US and others saying that they were used to a high level of emissions and carbon budget, and therefore the consequences for them to drop so drastically would be, too great to contemplate. And everyone, of course, every country as always has their reason why they shouldn't act first. But it had quite a lot of purchase for a while. We've also had the Greenhouse Development Rights Framework is another way of thinking about this. So there's lots of different ways of thinking about it. I guess the key challenge for us in thinking about just transitions is to get beyond and within the nation state as well, because as various people have alluded to here already, it's also about class and other gender and race and other dimensions as well. So it's not just about the US or the UK or India. We have to think about who's producing and consuming most carbon within those countries. So it's going back to some work we did a little while ago on behaviour change, it's what we would call the polluter elite that that needs to be targeted, and that polluter elite exists in the north and the south. So yeah, it was a useful principle, and I think it's a useful way of framing the debate. It brings into stark reality some of the key things we're dealing with. But as far as I know, it's not advanced hugely in the context of the climate negotiations. But others might correct me on that.
Does anyone want to come in on this?
Maybe just I agree with you, Peter. I think I also haven't really seen that used much other than in very generic statements about the right to development or just kind of the need for the global north to take the lead in cutting emissions. I just wanted to share an anecdote. It's not really super related, but I was really impressed at COP26. I was part of like a workshop that brought together a bunch of climate activists from various developing countries, and we had like a couple of local activists come and talk, and they were talking about energy poverty in Scotland and the battles that they were fighting in order to get better housing and get heating in the winter and things like that. And I think that was it's just something that points to these huge inequalities that we have everywhere, because some of the participants from Kenya and from India were completely like struck by the idea that there is something like energy poverty in the UK, and I think that's just so telling when you have these like little stories, that we see. That's why I just wanted to really agree with Peter on like really tackling these elites and the few that we have around the world that are really making a much bigger negative difference than the vast majorities of our populations.
Yeah, I also had a question about COP. Maybe we'll leave it to the end, but there is a lot to question or to perhaps say as well about that forum. But unless someone else would like to add, let me perhaps go to another question that John asked. Does the panel have a view on land value capture based rent extraction embedded in UK and other wealthier countries? Is progress on land value rent extraction in rich countries a prerequisite for global north-south justice transition? So the question of land value capture. I wonder to what exactly it's, how, John, maybe you could, if you're there online, maybe you could specify a little bit. What do you mean exactly, the relation between land value capture and rent extraction? Maybe
while John is elaborating, I'm not 100% sure, particularly on the progress as a prerequisite for global transition. But I do think that there is a substantial body of belief on the importance of carbon markets, nature-based solutions, peat restoration, for example, and a lot of these activities based on being able to access land. And I think it poses, it's of course peatland restoration very important, of course protecting and establishing reserves for preserving ecosystems and biodiversity, really important. But the whole idea of a just transition is that how that is done is very important. If it is done where it cuts off communities to access to commons, that common grazings or common land, or areas that had previously been fundamental to their livelihoods or their cultural and social and economic practices, then is that just? If and how do you negotiate that? Or on the other hand, with carbon markets and peatland restoration and things like that, what we are seeing in the Scottish example, and this is probably replicated in different parts of the world, is that rural land prices have soared or are soaring. And what that means is that wealthy billionaires can buy up land in Scotland in order to offset their carbon or to boost their green credentials, or what we call green lairds in Scotland, because of the sort of traditional very unequal land ownership. But then at the same time, local communities are not able to afford housing, and local communities are not able to be able to use the land in the way that they want. So I think that there is a massive risk in sort of using these pricing mechanisms, that this rent extraction approach can actually drive deeper inequalities, where you think you're raising resource for climate or just transition ambitions. And so I think that, yeah, the rent seeking related to land use, I think, probably manifests in many different ways, but a common feature is how that is done. Can we use, for example, if there is going to be a new wave of these carbon credits, how could you legislate to make sure that that primarily benefits communities through community asset ownership or management? How could that be done in a way that preserves ecosystems without, sort of increasing inequality? I think that that is a really important question for every locale in the world. Maybe John has elaborated by now.
Peter, please come in.
Yeah, I just want to be a bit provocative here, because it did strike me in that conversation about land, whether and going back to our previous one about scope for sort of solidarities, whether if countries of the global south were to say our land is not for sale for offsets, whether that would be, because there's so many governments and corporations in the global north assuming there's infinite land available that's just lying there idle to absorb their CO2 emissions. And if they were to sort of say, unless you get serious about loss and damage, you're not using our land for carbon offsets. This is my fantasy world of, fantasy justice game. Wouldn't it be fantastic if it's this sort of common statement, like we're going to stand together on this, you can't play us off against one another. No land for your offsets until you get serious about loss and damage, or hitting the 100 billion for climate finance. I'll throw that out as a sort of provocation, but it's just, there is some leverage there, right? It's obviously very poor, highly indebted countries are wanting to sell land, but if there was some collective scope for saying, enough's enough on the buying up land to get yourself out of trouble on climate, whether that would be a game changer. I know it's a bit fanciful.
Does anyone would like to come in and join Pierre in Eva, please?
Yeah, maybe I'd just like to say that this again kind of shows why history matters. This kind of long trend of land privatization since colonialism. And Katie mentioned nature-based solutions, for example, earlier. And I find I'm not saying that nature-based solutions are bad, but it just relies on knowledge and practices very often that were heavily marginalized and restricted under colonialism, and now kind of markets them all of a sudden as being green and good for the environment. And in many ways, it's also quite problematic. So paying attention to how these trends towards land privatization, land titling have advanced, and how that historically has caused injustices, I think is important again here.
All right, let's go to Daniel. Daniel asked two questions, so let me start with the first on growth and degrowth debate. You mentioned trade-offs and the need for accelerated mitigation. Is there a connection here to the green growth versus degrowth debate? Is it possible to achieve a global just transition if countries that have already overused resources continue to target growth, or is it a global just transition a win-win? Dunya? Yeah.
I mean, maybe just my personal answer, not the institutional answer, is that, I mean, for me, it's absolutely related. And I think that the key problem with the degrowth debate is that nobody wants to hear it somehow, no? Like none of the policymakers want to really hear it and want to embrace some of the ideas, even though I think a lot of it is really valuable, and we need to I mean, there's so much research and so many papers out there that showcase how we just can't keep growing on a global scale. And I think it's just so misunderstood that that means like kind of cutbacks across the board and everywhere, and that we'll just be miserable if we embrace degrowth. And I think there's a lot of work needs to be done in order to kind of really unpack what degrowth means, or maybe even give it a different name to get more people on board with some of the ideas behind it. I know that Julia Steinberger and colleagues have done some quite interesting work on trying to model how much of like material and physical resources one actually needs in a country in order to live well. So they're trying to really come up with new models, trying to understand what are our material and energy needs in order to live well, and not kind of go to this like scenario that a lot of the maybe more powerful actors in the debates paint as soon as somebody says degrowth or just challenges growth, no? And I think that's something where we need to also have a lot more discussions and kind of open up some of the discussions to topics, even if people are very hesitant by some of these ideas, because it's very scary how, in my opinion, how many people are coming just with this win-win-win logic, and they're just kind of trying to claim that everybody's going to be better off if we just buy into their one idea, and kind of at the end of the day, that's often business as usual scenarios painted a little bit green, no? And I think that's very, very dangerous.
Yeah, right. It's redefining growth as well, not just. I hope we mean it in that way, right? I think in academia this has been already for some time. So what do we mean? Even like, what do we mean by GDP? Is this our anchor indicator, or all of these things? But of course, it is very politically. It feels very different once you enter a space with non-academics. Let's put it that way. Would you like to come in, anyone? Peter, Eva, Katie, on growth versus degrowth?
Sure. I mean, I think the first, Daniel's last point in his question is global just transition a win-win. I think if we are honest with ourselves, no. Like the idea, I think the idea of the best, that sufficient sort of just transition, where some of the objectives of development in developing countries comes into tension with climate goals, because they will necessarily have to increase their emissions. And I think that sometimes, at the rhetorical level, we can gloss over these material realities, like the material sort of, if unless you are prepared to say that the majority of the world must remain in a persistent state of underdevelopment, then we are going to have to increase emissions in a big part of the world. And considering the population size, that it might be significant. So like, how do we do that? Or what is the sufficient strategy to make sure that those countries are not sort of investing in like what are going to be stranded assets down the line, are getting onto low carbon development pathways, and that is done in as mitigated a way as possible. So I think that's just an example of the fact that the idea of a just transition is more of like a guiding principle rather than a win-win scenario, because I think that that's just one sort of spoke of contradiction and tension of many different spokes in the wheel of a just transition. But to then go back to that sort of the growth degrowth, I mean, I think that it fundamentally does come back to, we are going to have to decrease resource use and emissions in advanced economies, and increase use in the global south. And how that is achieved, I think, when this fixation on growth or degrowth, I think, can kind of muddle the very common objectives of people who can be on both sides of that. I think if we mean degrowth as in resource efficiency and bringing down emissions and recentering onto economic outcomes that are about tackling inequality, you can have soaring growth, but that growth is for whom? For an elite class of financiers, which is, of course, makes the most recent debate in the UK very frustrating about this focus on we're here to deliver growth. And of course, we've seen how that turned out, because it's growth for whom. But at UNCTAD, I suppose, we also acknowledge that from an economic realism, if we are focused on bringing this level of investment to climate goals, which is in the trillions of dollars per year at minimum, we will need expansionary policies, which will mean spending money, which does mean growth. So I think that I think being careful about what we mean by that and where that accrues to, and being very focused and strict on the need for rapid mitigation. I think, and that's my way of trying to fuzz that, but I don't think that there is a straight either or answer to that. There's some clear, we need mitigation, we need to decelerate our emissions, but we also need to be investing to do that. Yeah, I'll stop there.
All right. Yes, let's shift a little bit gears, and Daniel takes us to the dystopian future. In the Ministry for the Future, it's a book. I don't know how many of you are aware. So Robinson, who is the author, imagines a world in which the lack of climate action leads to climate saboteurs from some of those affected communities taking things into their own hands. Is there a significant downside risk of backlash if we don't achieve a global just transition? The opportunity cost, in other words. Is there enough focus on this? Yeah, thanks for bringing this reference, Daniel. It's quite, yeah. So shall I repeat the question? Or feel free just to come in.
I can have a first go at that if you want. I mean, I think yes is the short answer, and I think we're already seeing signs of backlash already. So you see other environmental protesters frustrated at the lack of action, lack of representation, being excluded from processes, whether that's XR or Just Stop Oil, or people protesting pipelines, environmental defenders all around the world. But I think, the impacts of climate change itself in terms of migration and conflict in quite unstable areas of the world, all of these things are generating social and political and civic unrest. That's sort of fairly clear. And so I think, and you're seeing that across the spectrum. So there's sort of green activists or people on the left and trade unions mobilizing around these things, but also the political right, right? We've seen in the UK here, what was the what was it called now? So now it's called Net Zero Watch. It was the Global Warming Policy Foundation. So it's a climate skeptic funded think tank, and their new strategy is calling out the negative social impacts of net zero policies. So this is the new front in the culture wars and in the battle against action on climate change. So you see across the spectrum already people feeling aggrieved about the nature of climate policy, either think it's going too fast or not fast enough, or that they're not included, their voices are not being heard, their interests are being overridden, and that's leading to a lot of social unrest. And I think if we continue to not take those justice issues seriously, we can only see that get worse.
I think I agree with Peter, but I also think that in a lot of cases, as we see with the floods in Pakistan or the droughts in East Africa, people still just get overwhelmed by the negative impacts of climate change. And I don't know, I think this organized action to, I guess, sabotage, as the person posing the question framed it, I don't see that happening on a large scale yet, but just, yeah, I see many people struggling to cope with these negative effects of climate change and struggling to deal with the transition to a just future being too slow, rather than trying to sabotage its negotiation in the first place.
I think also the society that is described in this book is not a very low-income society, I think. So therefore, I guess it's a bit like a Luddites, yeah? They went and destroyed the tools, and I feel that that's a bit, at least that was my reading. Daniel, maybe you disagree, but yes, that's absolutely a valid point. It's just muddling through and surviving. That's the strategy, Eva, that you referred to in those affected regions. Your perspective, what are the major cooperation areas? What are the alliances that you see are most probable or feasible to be built there at various levels? It can be also multilateral institutions, global governance level, or it can be local level. But what, and if you could observe from your point of view, from your work, what do you think, where things are moving in a short run, in the immediate future, and what are, equally desirable, but more difficult and more feasible in the long run, even if we all commit, in that sense. So maybe I will ask Peter, if you don't mind, to start with you. I wanted to ask you about the area of energy transition, but please feel free, maybe just to respond, not only from the perspective of energy, but in general.
So in areas of cooperation, particularly going forward, yeah. I think a key challenge is that, many of the initiatives we've been talking about, or some of them at least, around just transitions are sort of hatched in quite closed spaces where there's a lack of participation of some of the key actors. So if you think about some of the announcements that were made at the Glasgow summit from governments like Nigeria and South Africa, they weren't coming from the bottom up. They weren't necessarily involving a broad range of key actors. And so this is something I discussed in a briefing that I've posted in the chat. I think there is an important role for funders and donors or international civil society organisations in trying to sort of work across some of the levels we've been talking about, from local and national, but also drawing in regional institutions. So institutions like the Economic Community of West African States, the East African Community, or the South African Development Community, SADC, and working with other coalitions as well. I mean, there's lots of people trying to open up space for these, difficult conversations that we've been talking about. There's the Open Government Partnership, Civic Space Learning Network, or the OECD Civic Space Observatory, but also some of the first mover coalitions that we've talked about. So I think Katie was talking about, can we imagine north-south forms of collaboration and cooperation that break the mold in some ways? Now, maybe the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance might be one way to do that. You did have Costa Rica involved alongside Denmark. You've got Italy and other countries joining. Of course, it's just a handful of states at the moment. But there are other ways in which collaborations like that, sort of within and between countries, could take hold. It's something we're struggling with, of course, in the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty that I'm quite involved in trying to bring in movements. So we've got indigenous, labour, environmental, religious-based movements on board, climate vulnerable countries supporting the initiative, and trying over time to bring in more and more governments. So there are some of these sort of bottom-up initiatives that are going on, but I do feel there's some work to do on the part of funders and others to form the connective tissue between these different levels of action.
Eva, perhaps to you, the question is how do you think countries in the African continent, for example, that you work on, how are some of these countries with extractive industries can have a stronger say in the forums? Is it regional? Is it put their resources strengthening national level, community level? Is it regional? Is it multilateral?
Yeah, I think on the one hand, some local NGOs that are being formed and that form alliances to address issues of pollution, environmental degradation are really important here. I also think on a more multilateral level, the Extractive Industries and Transparency Initiative has booked reasonable progress in a large number of countries in making investment streams and corruption in the extractive industries more visible. I also, in preparing for this roundtable, I prepared some quotes from Olufemi Taiwo's Reconsidering Reparations. And I'm not saying that I'm a big fan necessarily of climate reparations or that they will solve everything, but I do think it's an interesting idea to think with. So I would maybe just like to leave you with his quotes. And he says that climate reparations should be seen as a future-oriented project engaged in building a better social order, and that the costs of building a more equitable world should be distributed more to those who have inherited the moral liabilities of past injustices. So that's just something to think about, and yeah, maybe going forward.
Thanks, Eva. Dunya, would you like to come in? I wanted to ask you on the social dimension, but perhaps feel free to touch on any other area.
Yeah, sure. Maybe just to complement, and I think there's also quite a lot of room for new types of collaboration between different civil society groups and stakeholder groups that we see now, no, like that are still working quite isolated, or not isolated is not the right word, but they're still kind of very much focused on their own objectives and demands that they bring to these large tables, which of course makes sense because it's an extremely intricate process and trying to gain some influence. But I think one of the things that is a bit problematic with Just Transition is that it's still so much a worker focused issue that it gets often reduced to a very narrow view on who the workers are that need a just transition, and that kind of cuts out maybe other groups that would, I mean, indigenous peoples, women, the women majors group, all kinds of other groups, climate activists that are also workers, but maybe not organized primarily in their worker role, but in a different, along a different line. And I think there's quite a lot of room to try and bring some of these groups together and talk and maybe find some common ground in strengthen the negotiation positions. And we've seen this, I think, in different countries happening, at times successful, also often not super successful, because workers and climate activists especially are often also butting heads over the issues of who gets compensated and how fast the transition is happening and things like that. But then I think there's also quite some space for like reviving kind of this international trade union movement that really has this internationalist perspective, and kind of where workers in the North take a stronger advocating role for people in the global South and working people in the global South. And I think that's something that used to be a lot stronger than it is today, which is probably also a result of just increasing precarity and precariousness of jobs in the global North as well, and just kind of race to the bottom that we see everywhere, where we kind of really need to stand stronger across these different groups to kind of oppose not each other, but the people who are at the root causes of these issues.
That's a really great point. So solidarity could be uniting, that disadvantage can occur in different forms in different societies, but across the board, that at least the solidarity can unite. Katie, would you like to come in as well and speak?
For sure. Yeah, building on what Dunya was saying, I agree. I think that one scale of better or further collaboration and cooperation needs to be on taking the really exciting movements that have sprung up in recent years that trying to unite the economic and climate justice worlds, but often at the national scale, and they need to be sort of joined up in a more supranational understanding. You know, for example, that the recent bill in the US, the IRA, is focused on, of course, jobs for US workers and justice internally in the US, but I think that a lot of its advocates would also critique it that it doesn't really have an eye to the global justice element, and it's still sort of this persistent myth of US supremacy is sort of, and that's about a political economy question about what's going to be passed in that economic environment. And I think that that's one of the major challenges of trying to bring these systemically important economies like the US and like the European Union into dialogue with the realities of what transition demands in the South. I think from a sort of governmental level, you know, like I said, I would love to see more, you know, advanced economies and global South economies working together, particularly advanced economies who are willing to sort of speak out and say the jig is up. We need to stop acting like that somehow, you know, that these beggar thy neighbor or sort of winner takes all approaches is going to get us out of the climate crisis. I would love to see some sort of bravery there, which of course is a difficult thing to say if you plan to be re-elected. But that, I think I would love to see some more collaboration there, some sort of honest talk about what is demanded at the global level and from cooperation. I think, you know, the G77, which is the negotiating bloc for all developing countries in the COP process and indeed in the UN system, I think, you know, I think it's really promising that as much as there is divisions internally between countries, there is a strong united front on loss and damage, and I think that is something that, as I mentioned before, really needs to be built on, to sort of and to use that as a way of sort of exploring some of the tensions and the things that prevent people from being on the same page in the negotiations, because ultimately, as we've all been talking about, you need a strong countervailing power of countries that have, you know, some shared interests and a shared structural disadvantages in the global economy, and learning from one another. You know, there are countries that have maybe taken routes that, you know, aren't picture perfect, but that have maybe got them on a green developmental pathway, or have been able to make sure that the foreign direct investment they're getting isn't completely extractive, but is actually having positive spillover effects. What we call South-South sort of cooperation and collaboration. I think that needs to be strengthened. And then coming up, you know, I think that we are going to see some more developments on the debt distress front, and I would love to see, you know, rather than these piecemeal, non-systemic, sort of just enabling the prolonging of crisis policy responses that we have been seeing from the likes of the IMF, the G20, something that takes the debt and climate connection really seriously, so that countries everywhere have the fiscal space that they need when a climate disaster strikes, or to be able to deliver their just transition strategies. And then the second thing is an eye to, I know that COP27 hasn't happened yet, but an eye to COP28, where countries will begin agreeing a new collectivied quantified goal, the NCQG, which is not the best acronym, I'll admit, the NCQG, which is going to be where, you know, countries agree, okay, we failed at the 100 billion, what's the new goal? And I think moving towards that, as much as, you know, the 100 billion in some ways was a mirage, I would really love us to see some realistic numbers there and some realistic strategies to get us there that doesn't depend on the charitable, you know, feeling of whatever government is in position in whichever European or, you know, North American country, but that actually, you know, creates accountability into that climate finance system. So I've got a long wish list. I've got more, but I'll stop there.
before we indeed go into COP question, Peter, you raised your hand. Would you like to come in on, or was it just no?
No, I'm just dealing with a misbehaving dog. That's all. That's okay.
Yeah, it's the last question on my agenda. So also the participants who are there listening, please feel free to come in with more questions if you like. But we're approaching the end of our second hour. So I would like to talk about or ask you about the COP, because it is being organized as we speak, and I mean, if you could also compare, I mean, for COP26, everyone, okay, me, but also people whom I knew, were really approaching that event with a lot of hopes, in anticipation of a lot of progressive things, and so there was a bit of a like a breathing out when there were a lot of financial commitments, but announced and pledges made. But for example, on the just transition, there was a declaration signed by 17 governments and European Union, a relatively small scale, and at least in my reading. I wonder if we focus on just on the question of just transition, can we expect something more ambitious from COP27?
Don't feel so silly to have to speak after you all said something really smart. I think, I mean, it's funny that you bring up this declaration, Olga, because honestly, I remember being in Glasgow, being very like surprised by that declaration and like quickly reading through it and being quite impressed by fairly progressive, fairly ambitious language in it. But then I don't know about you, but I have not heard anything about that since, or what was like that supposed to do, or how was that supposed to advance the discourse and so on. So I think I would imagine that there will be definitely quite a bit of talk about the South Africa partnership and like some kind of focus on what has happened so far. I think the South African government also relatively recently released like a paper on the kind of structure and plan that they have created now for this partnership. I personally don't have very ambitious hopes or expectations to the COP, just because I imagine it will be quite overshadowed by geopolitical tensions in the world and the energy crisis. And maybe that will also, I mean, I think it'll definitely be very interesting to watch and to see how that plays out, because I think that also has reshuffled positions of power a little bit between countries, who are now very dependent on new sources of gas or energy in the short term. I think there's some very hopeful people who say it'll help us to accelerate the transition, because we see how bad it is to be so dependent on fossil fuels or on singular sources of fuels. But yeah, I'll stop here.
Katie, or?
Yeah, I'll keep my contribution short. I mean, I think it was notable that none of the countries that signed that declaration, the majority of them, they were all advanced economies. And so I think I would like to see in the further elaboration of just transition within the COP process, which is on the sidelines of the COP really, even though it's in the Paris Agreement, would be the developmental angle. And on top of that, I would like to see, I worry a little bit that the JETP model puts countries in competition for a small amount of resources that haven't actually been delivered yet to South Africa, beyond sort of the previous financial commitments, and they lose some of the local and national sovereignty they need to be able to deliver the just transitions that are designed for their people. And so I would like to see a further articulation of what it means to do just transition in the South when there is a dependence on external resources to get it off the ground. So that's what I would like to see. We'll see if that happens.
Eva, oh, Peter, okay.
Well, I was just going to follow on from that because I participated in an UNCTAD seminar the other day, which was raising a lot of these issues about the way in which that partnership is being held up as a model potentially. And, you know, there's talk of negotiations with other countries, but of course, you know, much of the money is essentially in the form of loans, right? It's not aid and and direct assistance. It's obviously a fraction of the costs of an overall transition. So, you know, one of the points that was being made was if the North is really serious about supporting transitions in the global South, it's going to really have to up its game, because if not, and this is obviously quite a critical moment, many countries in the region have now opportunities to go down a more carbon intensive fossil fuel path. And if there are not strong incentives to make sure they don't do that, and they do, you know, and get locked in and end up with stranded assets, then the North needs to be far more serious about what it's putting on the table, I think. But I think more broadly, clearly carbon finance and climate finance more broadly is going to be a big discussion point. And I think mainly it will be some countries seeking to hold the North to account, and of course pushing the loss and damage agenda. But as we know, there's huge amounts of resistance to taking those issues seriously, but they must be.
Yeah, and I think I can be really brief. So what has happened so far are mainly the quick fixes to bring carbon emissions down there where they hurt the least and allow business as usual to kind of continue. And I'm just really curious in the future to see if particular decisions start to really hurt, what will then happen, and how questions of justice will then be resolved, and whether any fundamental transformations of business as usual will occur. So yeah.
Yes, at least to get signatories from the non-northwestern group would be at least something I would like to hope, but also not just signatories, but to have them in the room, the governments of developing countries.